Noah Greenwald drops by to talk about how the Trump administration is destroying nature, the nature that keeps us alive, the nature that protects us from dangerous viruses. Check it out. Leave your comments, ding the bell, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. And in every case, it was the result of humans decreasing the habitat of wild animals, decreasing wild habitat. And as we were decreasing that wild habitat, the diseases that were being kept stable and away from us in that habitat were attacking us. And so in that context, it seems to me really important that we not destroy the wild anymore. Yet that's exactly what the Trump administration is trying to do. Tell us about this.
Yeah, so the Trump administration proposed a new rule in the last week that makes it harder to protect habitat for endangered species. And I absolutely agree with you in that diseases are coming from nature, and that if we want to avoid that problem, we have to protect more of the natural world. And in fact, the UN has a goal, 30 by 30 and 50 by 50, which would mean we would protect 30% of the natural world by 2030 and 50% by 2050. That's under the Convention on Biological Diversity. The U.S. is unfortunately one of only two countries that hasn't signed on to that. So that's unfortunate. In this case, what the Trump administration is doing is, under the Endangered Species Act, when a species is listed as threatened or endangered, one of the requirements is that the Fish and Wildlife Service designate critical habitat for them. And that is the area that they need to survive and recover. And it can include areas where they don't currently occur. And that's really important, because otherwise the only protections that endangered species get are for where they actually occur. And oftentimes endangered species have lost lots of range, and so they need to be recovered to a bigger area in order to be secure. What this does is it says essentially that for an area to be designated as critical habitat, it has to have habitat right now. And that's problematic in a lot of ways. So, for example, the northern spotted owl, right now it has over 9 million acres of critical habitat. And many of those acres aren't the old growth forests that the bird needs. They're young forests that have been logged, but they'll eventually become old growth. Under this proposed rule, Fish and Wildlife Service wouldn't be able to do that. They wouldn't be able to designate those areas because they presently don't have habitat. And in fact, under a settlement with the timber industry, the Trump administration is expected to issue a revised designation of critical habitat for the owl any day. And so we'll see how this rule impacts that.
Are they doing all this just for the logging industry, or are there other industries that want to, basically rape nature? It's
interesting. I mean, there are other industries, the oil and gas industry in particular, is one that's causing a lot of habitat destruction and has been in recent decades. So that's another one. But in this case, so this rule stemmed from some litigation over a species called the dusky gopher frog, which occurs in the southeast. It's one of many species that's dependent on longleaf pine forests. And so it is actually the timber industry that drove this, because that lawsuit was brought in part by Weyerhaeuser. And so what happened is the frog needs ephemeral ponds that are wet in the spring, and that's where they lay their eggs, and then it dries up, and so there's not fish in there to prey on their eggs. And then otherwise it mostly lives in the forest. It's restricted to basically one pond in Mississippi. And so you can imagine that one pond does not make a species secure. If anything happens to that, the species is basically gone. So the Fish and Wildlife Service has designated some critical habitat in Louisiana as well that had the ephemeral ponds. And but the frog hadn't been seen there since the 1960s. And the land was actually leased to Weyerhaeuser for logging. It didn't have the right kind of forest. It had slash pine rather than longleaf pine forest. So they argued that since it didn't have the longleaf pine forest, it couldn't be critical habitat, even though it could be restored to that. And it had the ephemeral ponds, which are actually kind of the more limiting thing for the frog. Weyerhaeuser, and one interesting twist about this was that Weyerhaeuser didn't own the land, and the landowner argued that the critical habitat impinged on him because he wanted to develop the land, which Weyerhaeuser has no interest in, obviously, because it would end their lease, essentially. But Weyerhaeuser sued anyway, which I hold that against them. I do. And so they lost at the district court. They lost at the appeals court. They took it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court gave them a very narrow ruling saying Fish and Wildlife Service hadn't defined habitat and has to do that. And so that's what generated this rule.
Ah, I see. So, and I probably should have used the word pillage instead of the word rape, but in any case, how extensive is the destruction of nature in the United States and around the world? Is that a number that you have at your fingertips?
You know, I haven't seen anyone quantify that number, you know, and that would be an interesting thing to try and do. But, you know, we have been losing a lot. And in particular, so, you know, something like old growth forests, you know, luckily we had the Northwest Forest Plan for the owl and the murrelet and for salmon on federal land in Oregon and Washington. So we protected a lot of what was remaining. But in exchange, we basically let go of it on private and state land. So we've continued to see loss of old growth forests in the Northwest. You know, other examples are, you know, in the last 10, 15 years, we saw massive oil and gas development in North Dakota on the Bakken oil reserves, and then in the Permian Basin in New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma. So we've seen, you know, massive habitat destruction there as well. The Permian Basin's been the biggest oil play in the world for, you know, the last decade or so. Tar sands in Canada, you know, so we continue to see habitat destruction ongoing in North America and in the world. You know, I'm 52, and so in my lifetime, the human population has gone from 3.5 billion to 7 billion. And that, in combination with consumption patterns, has, you know, really led to a great deal of habitat destruction.